A lot is happening on the front lines in Ukraine. Russia is attacking, Ukraine is attacking. It can be hard to keep the big picture. So in this video, I want to give an overview of how things are going. It's been a while since I last made a video with an update on the front lines. In fact, it was all the way back in December. So I want to give sort of the big picture of what has happened since then. But first, I'm going to start with a quick look at how the situation is right now. And I'm using maps from deepstatemap.live. First, in the north, there is still nothing that indicates that there is going to be an attack from Belarus, so we can get quickly over that. I will not say that it's totally impossible that it could happen at some point in the future, but there is nothing that indicates that it's going to happen anytime soon. Then in the Sumy sector, the situation is also pretty much still unchanged. There is some fighting across the border from time to time, but in general, both sides are staying on their side of the border. Then we come to the actual front lines. Here, the Russians are on the offensive pretty much along the whole front line from the Kharkiv area in the north to the Donetsk area in the south. They have been trying to achieve breakthroughs for months, but so far they've had pretty limited success. They have been able to gain some kilometers here or there, but it's not something that can really be called a breakthrough. It has been less intensive in the south, but there has also been some fighting there too. And also across the Dnipro River, there has also been some cases where sort of small groups of soldiers have crossed the river, and there's been quite a lot of artillery fire across the water. But the most intensive fighting is, without comparison, happening in the east. And there are many sort of smaller offensives in different places, and I won't go through all of them. The overall picture is that Russia has been trying to push hard in many places, hoping to get a breakthrough, but Ukraine has been able to hold out pretty well over the winter. I think this can be illustrated by comparing the picture from before Russia's winter offensive with how it looks today, now here in the end of March. So this was the picture on December 7th. And this was March 24th. And if we switch back and forth, we can see that sort of in the big scheme of things, the front line has not moved very much. So this is not a particularly impressive result of a big offensive. It shows that Russia has not been able to push the front line in a significant way. And it's not like they haven't been trying. Like, they have thrown all the resources that they had available into doing this, but it just wasn't enough. So this shows that Russia at the moment is unable to make a decisive blow against the Ukrainians. There is this area up here that is around the city of Bakhmut, and that is actually the only place where we can say that Russia has been able to make significant gains that sort of are visible on a map of this scale. So let's zoom in on that. Here, the Russians have been able to almost surround the city, and for a long time, it looked like the Ukrainians would leave the city and pull back to new defensive positions west of Bakhmut and continue the fighting from there. But then, somewhat unexpectedly, President Zelensky came out and said that they were not going to do that, and that instead Ukraine would reinforce the area and keep fighting for the city. There has been a lot of discussion about what the purpose is of that and whether it was a smart choice, because it's pretty clear that Ukraine has a counteroffensive coming later in the spring, and many people believe that it would be better for Ukraine to pull back to sort of better positions and focus on attrition of the Russian forces, and then to use their resources on preparing the counteroffensive instead of fighting for Bakhmut. So I, of course, also have a theory about what's going on in Bakhmut. But before I get to that, I want to talk a bit about how I think we can understand the big picture. If we go back to December, there was a lot of discussion about what Russia and Ukraine were going to do over the winter, how they were going to handle the winter war. And in my video from back then, I talked about how Avril Haines, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, had predicted that the winter would be sort of a low-intensity period because both sides were going to take a pause. And I said I believe that assessment was wrong because it just didn't make sense. On the Ukrainian side, the last thing the Ukrainians wanted to do was to give sort of Russia a break. They had the momentum during the fall. And of course, they were not going to give Russia time to reconstitute and prepare for a spring offensive. And then on the Russian side, it just didn't fit what was happening on the ground. Like, it didn't look like Russia was taking a break. And it frankly more looked like Putin was pushing his generals into some kind of offensive action, even though, like, from a military point of view, that was probably a bad idea. But that's what it looked like they were doing. So my prediction was that both sides were going to push on during the winter. Like, Ukraine would do it because they would want to keep the pressure on the Russians. And Russia would do it because Putin was impatient. And if we look at how it went, then I think this was more or less what happened. But it happened in a way that was very good for Ukraine because in January and February, Russia launched a big offensive. And in land warfare in general, the defense is stronger than the offense. So the side that is attacking will take much bigger losses than the side that is defending. And that meant that Ukraine could achieve their goal of keeping the pressure on the Russians while also having the advantage of the defensive position. If the Russians had not made that winter offensive, then Ukraine would have had to attack instead and just to keep the pressure on them. And then Ukraine would have taken much bigger losses. But in my view, Putin made a stupid mistake by pushing his generals into a winter offensive. And the Ukrainians were smart to take advantage of that and to take the defensive position when it happened. But it was also a super luxurious position for the Ukrainians because it meant that the Russians were basically doing their work for them. Like the Russians were causing attrition to themselves. And we have to remember that when we look at what's happening now in Bakhmut and on the front line in general. Like, this luxurious situation would have to end eventually. It could not keep on going like that forever. So around the time when the Russians looked like they were about to take Bakhmut and it seemed like Ukraine might leave the city, it also started looking like the Russian offensive was about to run out of energy. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group that is responsible for the attacks in Bakhmut, he even came out and said publicly that when they had taken the city, they would take a break to focus on sort of consolidation and rebuilding their strengths. And this was in the end of February, like months before Ukraine would be ready with their big counteroffensive, which will probably come in April or May or maybe June. So this gets me back to what I think is happening in Bakhmut. I think the Ukrainian leadership was afraid that if they withdrew from Bakhmut and resumed positions west of the city, then the Russians might not follow them, that the Russians were going to take an operational pause. And that meant that the attrition of the Russian forces would then stop. And that would just be unacceptable if the Ukrainians want their counteroffensive to work, because in that case, it's very important that the Russians continue to take high losses right until the Ukrainian counteroffensive begins. And that's why Ukraine decided to keep fighting for Bakhmut, because Russia has to keep fighting until they get this city. Like, they have been fighting for Bakhmut since the summer. There are some estimates that say that about 30,000 Russians have lost their lives in the battle for Bakhmut so far. And if they don't manage to take the city, then all that was for nothing. And that is just politically unacceptable in Russia. So by staying in Bakhmut, Ukraine is essentially nudging Russia into the sunken cost fallacy. Like, Russia has to keep pouring resources into the fight because they don't want to have wasted all the resources that they have already spent. And it's working, because Russia is pouring more resources into Bakhmut. And now they're also trying to encircle the city of Avdiivka further south. So Russia is definitely not taking an operational pause, and they're still taking heavy losses. And yes, Ukraine is taking losses too. And the loss ratio is maybe not as good as it was in January and February. I think we should assume that the Ukrainian decision to stay in Bakhmut means that they are also taking more losses than if they could have pulled back and continued the fight from better positions. But at least it means that the Russians are still on the attacking side, which is good for Ukraine. If the Ukrainians had pulled out and the Russians had then not continued their offensive, then the Ukrainians would have been in a position where they would have had to turn it around and start attacking themselves to keep the intensity high. And that would have been much worse. So I think that's how we should understand the fight in Bakhmut. It ensures that the Russians will keep throwing more resources into an offensive that they probably should have stopped a long time ago. So in that sense, Bakhmut has become a kind of generator for the dynamics on the front line, a bit like Kherson was a generator back in the fall. So in the big picture, I think Ukraine is coming out of this winter in a pretty good position. The Russians have made a mistake by launching a winter offensive, and that has meant that Ukraine has been in a super advantageous position in January and in February. Now the Russian offensive is sort of running out of steam, and that means that Ukraine has to have a more offensive posture in order to keep the intensity high. But if Putin had not been so impatient and had not pressured his generals into a winter offensive, then that would have been the situation all along. So I think we should expect this to be the situation until Ukraine launches their real counteroffensive. More and more, we will see Ukraine making small offensives here and there, both to keep the pressure on the Russians, but also just to test sort of the Russian defensive positions and to find out where the weak spots are. But the real counteroffensive is still some time away, and it will be significantly bigger. Overall, I think there are two things that we can say now on the basis of how things have gone over the winter. The first one is that Russia has demonstrated that they do not have the strength to push the front line. They've tried, and they failed. We don't know if the Ukrainians are strong enough to push the front line. We will know a lot more about that in a few months when we see how their counteroffensive is going. But we do know that the Russians can't do it. And the other thing that we know is that Russia has expended a lot of their resources over the winter. And we know that they are increasingly facing a shortage of manpower and material. So I will not go into the question of a new wave of mobilization in Russia in this video. I might do that in another video. But I will say that Putin should have done this months ago. Russia is going to have a shortage of manpower because he has hesitated to make that decision. So all in all, I think Ukraine is coming out of the winter in a pretty good position. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful, please give it a like, and also remember to subscribe to the channel and also press the bell icon to get notifications when I upload a new video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.